What are some military conspiracies that turned out to be true? Story 1: The Soviets stole an Abrams tank off a train. This actually happened. In the fog of Cold War intelligence operations, both superpowers ran aggressive programs to acquire each other's military hardware, and occasionally, one side got extremely lucky. The claim that Soviet intelligence operatives stole an M1 Abrams tank from a rail shipment moving between West Berlin and West Germany sits in the documented category of Cold War hardware theft rather than pure legend, though the specific details of the operation remain partially classified. The M1 Abrams, when it entered service in 1980, represented a generational leap in American armored vehicle technology. Its Chobham composite armor, its 105 EME gun, its gas turbine engine, each of these was of enormous intelligence value to a Soviet Union running its own armored vehicle development programs in parallel. The Soviets had well-established pipelines for acquiring Western military hardware, ranging from purchased defectors' information to outright theft of physical components, whole vehicles, and aircraft. Rail shipments moving through divided Germany were a known vulnerability, since the logistics of Allied military movements through East German territory created specific exposure points. Soviet intelligence services operating in West Germany during this period were extraordinarily active and resourceful, and the claim that an Abrams or significant components of one were acquired through a rail interdiction operation is consistent with documented Soviet intelligence capabilities and priorities of the period. Whether the full tank or specific key components, particularly armor samples and engine specifications, were acquired, and what intelligence value they yielded for Soviet armored vehicle development remains in the category of things that intelligence services know and haven't fully disclosed. The story circulates in military intelligence circles specifically because it's plausible, specific, and consistent with everything else that's documented about Cold War hardware acquisition operations on both sides. Story 2: Soviet and American special forces fought each other in Vietnam. Directly, the Vietnam War was officially a conflict between North Vietnam, its allied Viet Cong forces, and South Vietnam backed by the United States. Unofficially, Soviet military advisors, pilots, and special operations personnel were present in North Vietnam in numbers and roles that went considerably beyond what either government wanted publicly acknowledged. And the documented record suggests that direct armed contact between American and Soviet military personnel occurred, carefully deniable, never officially acknowledged, but real. The Soviets provided not just equipment, the SA-2 surface-to-air missile systems, MiG fighters, radar installations, but the trained personnel to operate them and to instruct North Vietnamese counterparts. Soviet radar operators and missile crews were active participants in the air defense of North Vietnam, which means they were shooting at American aircraft with American pilots, which constitutes direct combat, regardless of the diplomatic fiction that they were purely advisors. The specific claim of direct engagement between American and Soviet special operations forces is harder to document from open sources and remains in the category of documented but classified, rather than fully open historical record. What is documented, SOG operators conducted cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia that sometimes encountered forces that didn't behave like North Vietnamese regulars or Pathet Lao. Soviet Spetsnaz operated in the region. The overlap is logical even without confirming documentation. Both governments had strong incentives to keep any direct engagements completely quiet. The alternative was acknowledging that the two nuclear-armed superpowers had directly shot at each other, which is exactly the kind of escalatory acknowledgement that Cold War management protocols were specifically designed to avoid. The firefights happened, or something very much like them happened. The official record says otherwise because the official record is the managed version. Story 3: The Kandahar Giant. The Special Forces story that won't go away, the Kandahar Giant story, emerged from accounts attributed to American Special Forces operating in Afghanistan, describing an encounter in a cave complex in the Kandahar region with an enormous humanoid, described as approximately 12 to 15 feet tall, red-haired, with 6 fingers on each hand and double rows of teeth, that attacked and ended at least one soldier before being put down by the team. The account holds that the body was transported out by helicopter for analysis and subsequently classified, with the soldiers involved ordered to silence. The story has circulated in veteran communities and alternative history circles for years and has the specific texture of a first-hand account passed along several remnants from the original, detailed enough to be memorable, vague enough on verifiable specifics to resist confirmation or definitive debunking. The 6 fingers and double teeth details are consistent with biblical descriptions of the Nephilim, giant descendants of supernatural beings described in Genesis, which is how the story connects to existing frameworks for people inclined to take it seriously. What's documented and confirmed: caves in the Kandahar region did harbor significant Taliban and insurgent forces, and American Special Operations Forces did conduct numerous operations in those cave systems with high operational security. Helicopter transport of sensitive items and personnel was common and rarely documented in publicly accessible records. What's not documented? Any military record, medical examiner report, photograph, physical evidence, or named on record source that confirms the encounter. Every version of the story arrives as something a friend of a veteran told, something a soldier described to a researcher off the record, something in a classified debrief nobody has seen. This is the structure of a legend, not of a confirmed event, which doesn't make it uninteresting, just unverified. Story 4F-117 wreckage parts reached Russia and may have influenced the Su-57 on March 27, 1999. Serbian air defenses achieved something the United States had considered essentially impossible. They shot down an F-117 Nighthawk stealth aircraft over Serbia during Operation Allied Force. The pilot ejected and was rescued. The aircraft, which the Serbs had tracked by coordinating multiple radar systems to detect the F-117's small radar cross-section at specific radar frequencies, came down in a field near the town of Bujanovci. The wreckage was photographed and documented publicly. What happened next is the contested part. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic reportedly offered China and Russia access to the wreckage, which represented an extraordinary intelligence opportunity. The F-117 was the world's first operational stealth aircraft, and its radar-absorbent materials, structural shaping, and component designs were among the most closely guarded military technology secrets of the era. Whether Russia, China, or both took Milosevic up on this offer is the question the open record doesn't fully answer. The circumstantial evidence that Russian engineers got meaningful access to F-117 materials is considered credible by military analysts for a specific reason. The Sukhoi Su-57, Russia's 5th-generation stealth fighter, shows development trajectory and specific design features that analysts have argued reflect knowledge of how the F-117 stealth technology actually worked, rather than purely theoretical development. This is inference from design analysis rather than a confirmed documentary chain. But it's the kind of inference that intelligence communities take seriously. American officials at the time openly warned that allies in the region should secure whatever wreckage they found before outside parties acquired it, which is the diplomatic way of saying exactly what the story is claiming happened. Story 5: the CIA genuinely believed the Soviets were building particle beam weapons and space battle stations during the late 1970s and through the 1980s. CIA assessments of Soviet military technology took directions that seem, in retrospect, like something from a science fiction film. But these were serious, funded, intelligence community conclusions that shaped American defense policy and budget decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The particle beam weapons assessment was based on genuine Soviet research programs. Particle accelerators have both civilian and potential military applications, and Soviet work in this area combined with intelligence from human sources inside the program and signals intelligence from research facilities, led CIA analysts to conclude that the Soviets were working toward a directed energy weapon that could destroy aircraft, missiles, or satellites in flight. The assessment that such a weapon might reach initial operational capability by the mid-1990s was incorporated into threat assessments that fed directly into the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars missile defense program, and helped justify its enormous cost. The militarized space station assessment was similarly grounded in real Soviet space activity. The Soviet Almaz military space station program was real. The Soviets did operate military crewed space stations for reconnaissance and targeting purposes, and they did test anti-satellite weapons from orbital platforms. The projection of that into fully weaponized orbital battle stations was an extrapolation that the CIA's analysts considered credible based on Soviet trajectory. Whether those specific weapon systems would have been operational by 1995 became moot when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. What the programs reveal is that both sides were genuinely, seriously pursuing military technology in the 1980s that sounds fantastical from a 2025 perspective, and spending real money and deploying real scientists toward making it work. Story 6, a Soviet sensor could see the F-1 Devon. That's why the F-22 and F-35 have that silvery skin. This is a genuine documented piece of military technology history that most people don't know, and it explains a specific, visible design feature of America's two frontline stealth fighters in a way that connects Cold War intelligence to current hardware. The F-117 Nighthawk achieved stealth primarily through its distinctive angular shape, its faceted surfaces deflecting radar energy away from the emitting radar rather than reflecting it back, in combination with radar-absorbent coating materials. This approach worked against the radar frequencies primarily used by Soviet air defense systems in the 1970s and 1980s. What the designers didn't fully account for was IRST, infrared search and track, a passive sensor system that detects the heat signature of aircraft and their engines without emitting any radar signal that could betray the sensor's presence or alert the target aircraft. Testing conducted in the 1990s, when intelligence services obtained access to Soviet IRST systems, found that these sensors could track the F-117 effectively. The F-117's exhaust system, designed to reduce infrared signature compared to conventional jets, was still visible enough to be trackable. The angular, jagged external surface also created specific thermal emission patterns that IRST could follow. The response to this finding is directly visible in the F-22 and F-35 designs. Both aircraft have smooth, blended skins with a distinctive metallic coating that is specifically engineered to manage infrared as well as radar signature. The silvery skin is part of a multispectral stealth approach that addresses the vulnerability the IRST testing revealed. This is a case where intelligence about an adversary's sensor capability directly changed the design of the follow-on aircraft that replaced the vulnerable one. Story 7, Project Skyhorse, the CIA program that nearly gave Taiwan nuclear weapons. Project Skyhorse was a CIA-backed operation in the early 1980s that came significantly closer to giving Taiwan an independent nuclear weapons capability than most people realize, and was shut down specifically because the Reagan administration concluded it created more strategic problems than it solved, not because it was technically unachievable. Taiwan had made serious attempts to develop nuclear weapons dating back to the late 1960s, driven by reasonable concerns about its security situation relative to mainland China. The IAEA had previously dismantled a Taiwanese nuclear research reactor being used in weapons development work, and the U.S. had pressured Taiwan into renouncing weaponization under the existing nuclear cooperation framework. By the early 1980s, elements within the Taiwanese military and some within the CIA saw a covert nuclear program as a deterrence option worth exploring. Skyhorse, as described in intelligence community discussions that have emerged in various forms through declassified documents and researcher interviews over subsequent decades, involved providing Taiwan with specific technical assistance and potentially fissile material access that would allow a rapid completion of weaponization work. A bomb-in-the-basement capability that could be activated quickly if Taiwan faced an existential military threat from the mainland. The Reagan CIA's decision to shut it down was driven by strategic calculus. A nuclear-armed Taiwan would have fundamentally destabilized the relationship with China that the Nixon-era rapprochement had built, potentially driving China toward closer alignment with the Soviet Union at exactly the moment when American strategy was benefiting from the Sino-Soviet split. The benefit of a nuclear Taiwan didn't outweigh the cost of what China might do in response. The program ended. Taiwan remained non-nuclear, as it remains today. Story 8: The Rock Apes of Vietnam and Foo Fighters. When soldiers see things that don't make the report, Vietnam veterans report a category of encounter that doesn't fit neatly into official military records. Encounters with something in the jungle that moved like a primate, was substantially larger than any known species in the region, and behaved in ways that experienced soldiers found genuinely alarming. These reports are often grouped under the informal term rock apes, creatures encountered in the mountainous jungle terrain that threw rocks at American patrols, stood upright in ways that didn't match known primate posture, and left traces that didn't match any identified species. The encounters are consistent enough across independent veteran accounts that researchers have taken them seriously as a potential cryptozoological phenomenon, and the claim that North Vietnamese government expeditions were dispatched to investigate similar reports is cited by researchers in this area as evidence that whatever was being seen wasn't purely an American hallucination or cultural projection. Vietnam's jungles remain among the least biologically surveyed terrain on Earth, and genuine new mammal species continue to be discovered there. The saola, a large ungulate, was unknown to science until 1992. The Foo Fighters, by contrast, have documented multinational corroboration. American, German, Japanese, and British pilots during World War II all reported small, fast-moving lights that seemed to track aircraft with apparent intelligence. None of the explanations proposed, ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, misidentified aircraft, fully account for all the reported behaviors. Both sides investigated them as potential enemy weapons and found nothing, which means both sides were seeing the same unidentified thing, and neither could explain it. That specific combination, multinational, wartime, trained military observer corroboration with no identified explanation, is what keeps this category of report in serious, rather than purely fringe discussion. Story 9: World War I Wolves. The Eastern Front nightmare nobody wants to research. The Eastern Front of World War I produced some of the most sustained, most brutal, and least documented combat of the entire war. A war that was already uniquely horrible in its industrialized ending. The specific story this entry is pointing toward involves the ecological consequences of combat that lasted for years across vast stretches of forest terrain. The shelling, burning, and abandonment of large forest areas across what is now Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states created conditions that, according to accounts that circulated during and after the war, produced an unusual predator crisis. The claim, documented in a small number of contemporary accounts and military histories of the Eastern Front, is that gray wolf populations in the forests adjacent to frontline areas underwent a significant behavioral change. The combination of destroyed habitat, eliminating normal prey, the large numbers of unburied human and animal dead on and near battlefields, and the isolation of forest areas from normal human activity allowed wolf populations to increase dramatically in some areas, and to develop what naturalists would describe as human habituation, learning that humans were a food source rather than a threat. The accounts describe wolf packs of exceptional size attacking wounded soldiers, men separated from units, and in some accounts small patrols in forested areas. The specific claim of cross-line cooperation between German and Russian units to address the wolf threat is the most extraordinary element, that opposing forces in an active war temporarily coordinated to deal with an animal threat both sides faced. This claim is supported by a small number of accounts, but not by formal military records, which is unsurprising. No military would want it documented that they had cooperated with the enemy, even for this reason. It remains a compelling, historically textured story at the uncertain boundary between documented history and wartime legend. Story 10, The Real Russian Army. The legendary force that's always about to arrive. This entry is a joke, and a very specific, very dry joke that anyone who has followed commentary on Russia's military performance since the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine will immediately recognize. When the Russian military's conventional ground forces began showing unexpected weaknesses in their initial campaign, logistics failures, tactical disorganization, equipment losses, and command problems that didn't match the fearsome reputation Russia had cultivated for its professional military over the previous decade, a running commentary developed online that the forces visible in Ukraine were not the real Russian military. The real Russian army, this ironic commentary suggested, was being held in reserve and would arrive at any moment, sweeping all before it and vindicating the analysts who had predicted Russian dominance. The joke persisted and evolved as the war continued, with the real Russian army is coming any day now becoming a sardonic shorthand for the expectation that never arrives. It draws on genuine military analysis that had overstated Russian capability prior to the invasion based on equipment lists, official order of battle, and the relative success of the 2014 Crimea operation, which turned out to have involved conditions that didn't generalize to the full-scale campaign that followed. It's also worth noting that the real Russian army framing has been applied in other contexts throughout Russian military history. The gap between official capability and demonstrated performance is a recurring theme that goes back considerably before 2022. The legend of a hidden, superior force kept in reserve, while an inferior one fights, has served various political purposes in various Russian contexts across the centuries. The internet joke is new. The underlying phenomenon is considerably older. Story 11, Red Spectrum NVGs and the Vietnam Demons. When night vision technology made soldiers see things, this story occupies the specific category of military legend that's anchored in a real technology program and a real documented decision, with the supernatural element being either a genuine unexplained phenomenon or a psychophysiological response to the technology itself. And the difficulty of distinguishing between those explanations is exactly what makes it interesting. The red spectrum night vision technology is real. Early image intensification night vision devices experimented with different wavelengths of light amplification, and various developmental systems during the Vietnam era used different spectral ranges before the green phosphor display became the established standard. The US military did make a deliberate choice to standardize on green spectrum displays, and that decision is documented. The specific claim that soldiers using red spectrum NVGs in Vietnam reported seeing humanoid figures, described variously as demons or shadow entities, moving through the jungle canopy, and that helicopter gunners fired on targets that weren't there when investigated, exists in veteran oral history and in the specific community of people who take seriously the idea that different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum might reveal things ordinarily invisible to human perception. The mundane explanation is psychophysiological. Red wavelength light affects the eye's photoreceptors differently from green light, potentially producing specific visual artifacts, edge enhancement effects, and contrast patterns that the human visual system could plausibly parse as movement or figures in complex visual environments like jungle canopy at night. The experience of soldiers reporting consistent specific phenomena under specific technology conditions, and the experience stopping when the technology was changed, is the documented part. What the soldiers were seeing is the part that remains genuinely open. Story 12, Antarctica Portal to Hell. 10-foot super soldiers, lightning rifles. The premise. Examined honestly, this entry is presented as what it is: a maximally absurd conspiracy theory stacked several layers deep. self-aware enough in its construction to read as comedy rather than sincere belief, and worth treating as exactly that, while also briefly engaging with the real kernel of weirdness that Antarctica conspiracy theories consistently draw on. The actual Antarctica facts, stripped of elaboration, are themselves genuinely unusual by ordinary standards. Antarctica is the most restricted major landmass on Earth. The Antarctic Treaty limits what nations can do there and who can go. It restricts military activity, and it has been the subject of more international coordination and secrecy than almost any other geographic location. The continent contains subglacial lakes, Lake Vostok being the most famous, that have been sealed from the surface for millions of years and potentially harbor unusual microbial life. The ice contains atmospheric records going back hundreds of thousands of years. Germany conducted a significant Antarctic expedition in 1938-39 that has generated its own conspiracy literature. Various real-world classified military and scientific operations have occurred in or near Antarctica over the decades, including Operation High Jump in 1946-47, a large-scale U.S. Navy Antarctic expedition that conspiracy theorists have linked to everything from German remnants to alien bases. The vagueness around the expedition's actual findings and the unusually large military presence involved has fueled speculation for 80 years. None of this supports lightning-shooting super soldiers or interdimensional portals. It does support the observation that Antarctica is one of the most genuinely mysterious and least accessible places on Earth, and that genuine information gaps, combined with classified operations, will always generate folklore trying to fill them. Story 13: Roman Ghosts in the Vietnam War. And the historical trail that makes it weirder, the Vietnam War, generated a remarkable volume of supernatural encounter stories from both sides. Encounters with ghosts, spirits, figures from Vietnamese folklore, and presences in the jungle that soldiers on both sides attributed to the extraordinary density of death that had accumulated across the region over decades of continuous conflict. The Vietnamese Buddhist and animist traditions have specific frameworks for the spirits of those who die violently without proper burial rites, and by the time of the American War, many years of combat had produced conditions that these traditions would regard as spiritually catastrophic. The specific claim about Roman soldier apparitions is the genuinely strange one. Reports attributed to soldiers on both sides described encounters with figures in recognizably Roman-style military dress, speaking what was later identified as Latin. This sits in the category of folklore that gets stranger the more you pull at it, because there is in fact a documented historical thread connecting the Roman Empire to Southeast Asia that most people don't know exists. The Battle of Gizi in 36 BCE, which Roman and Chinese historians have studied in various ways over the decades, may represent the easternmost military engagement involving Roman soldiers in history. More specifically, some Roman prisoners from the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where Crassus was defeated and ended by the Parthians, may have ended up in Central Asian mercenary service and eventually in Chinese military deployment, with some historians arguing that the fortification techniques described in Chinese accounts of a battle at Gizi match Roman military engineering practices. Did Roman soldiers or their descendants make it as far as Southeast Asia? The documented evidence doesn't confirm it. The historical thread exists, which makes the ghost stories, if that's the right word, at least more contextually interesting than they appear at first look. Story 14: A Colder War by Charles Stross. When military horror fiction is almost too plausible, A Colder War is a 2000 novella by Charles Stross, published in Spectrum SF and available freely online, and it deserves the recommendation here specifically because it does something that great speculative fiction can do that straight historical analysis cannot. It makes you feel the texture of the cold. War's genuine epistemic horror, rather than just intellectually understanding it. The premise takes the Cold War's documented weapons programs, the actual classified projects, the genuine paranoia about adversarial technological capabilities, the real history of American and Soviet intelligence trying to determine what the other side had developed, and inserts the Cthulhu mythos as the hidden real weapons technology both sides were actually competing over. In Strauss's version, the nuclear arsenals are not the most dangerous thing either side has developed. The entities from H.P. Lovecraft's fictional cosmology is real. Both sides have achieved limited weaponization of them, and the Cold War's restraint is maintained not by mutually assured destruction, but by mutual awareness that the alternative is something genuinely worse. What makes this work as fiction is that it extrapolates plausibly from real documented behavior. The American and Soviet governments really did fund remote viewing research. The real intelligence services really were pursuing every avenue of potential advantage, including ones that mainstream science would dismiss. The specific psychological texture of classified program culture, the compartmentalization, the need to know restrictions, the way bureaucratic normalization can surround genuinely insane facts, is reproduced accurately. It's fiction, but it's the kind of fiction that once read makes the real documented Cold War history feel slightly more consistent with the fictional version than you'd like it to. Story 15, The Philadelphia Experiment, the naval legend that keeps not dying, the Philadelphia Experiment, is a classic American military conspiracy theory that has been circulating since the 1950s, with enough specific detail to feel like it might be true and enough substantive problems to make serious researchers skeptical. The core claim, the US Eldridge, a Navy destroyer escort, was used in October 1943 as the subject of an experiment conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that rendered the ship invisible to radar, possibly to the human eye, through some form of powerful electromagnetic field generation. In more elaborate versions of the story, the experiment also produced teleportation and time travel effects, with crew members fused to the ship's structure and others haunted by psychological damage afterward. The primary source for the story is a set of annotated copies of Morris K. Jessup's 1955 book, The Case for the UFO, which were mailed to the Office of Naval Research in 1956 and contained handwritten marginalia from a man calling himself Carlos Allende, who claimed to have witnessed the experiment from a nearby ship. Allende also wrote directly to Jessup with these claims. Subsequent investigation has never confirmed either Allende's presence on any ship near the Eldridge during the relevant period, or any witness from the Eldridge's actual crew who reported the described events. The Navy's response over the decades has been consistent and specific. The Eldridge was in New York during the period the experiment was claimed to have occurred in Philadelphia, and its deck logs, which are preserved, confirm a different location and standard operations during that period. What the Navy genuinely was doing with degaussing technology, electromagnetic systems designed to reduce a ship's magnetic signature and thereby protect against magnetic mines, during this period provides the kernel of reality the story is built around. The actual technology is mundane and well documented. The legend built on top of it is considerably more entertaining. Story 16, The Vela Incident, a nuclear explosion nobody will officially claim on September 22, 1979. An American Vela satellite detected a distinctive double-flash signature over the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, the specific optical signature, called a bang meter reading. That Vela satellites were specifically designed to detect as evidence of a nuclear detonation. Every previous confirmed nuclear test had produced exactly this signature. The 1979 event produced it too. What happened next is the mystery. Nobody has ever officially confirmed who conducted the test. A Carter administration panel concluded in 1980 that the event was more likely a false alarm or satellite malfunction than an actual nuclear detonation, despite the bang meter having never previously produced a false positive for a nuclear event. That conclusion has remained disputed ever since by physicists, intelligence analysts, and researchers who have examined the available data. The most widely credited attribution among researchers who consider it a genuine nuclear event points to a joint South African-Israeli test conducted in secret over a remote stretch of ocean. Both countries had covert nuclear weapons programs in 1979. Israel had possessed nuclear weapons since the late 1960s, and South Africa developed its own capability, which it later dismantled during this period. A joint test would have allowed South Africa to validate a design while giving Israel useful data outside its own territory and away from intelligence scrutiny. Subsequent analysis of hydroacoustic data, atmospheric sampling, and the specific spatial location, the bangmeter data, suggests all support the genuine detonation hypothesis over the malfunction hypothesis. The Carter panel's conclusion has been criticized as politically motivated. A genuine confirmed detonation would have created enormous diplomatic problems with South Africa and potentially forced a confrontation with Israel over its undisclosed arsenal. The evidence points somewhere. Nobody official has ever confirmed where. Story 17, Fog Bank, the secret nuclear ingredient America forgot how to make fog bank, is one of the more genuine and well-documented cases of classified military material on this list. And what makes it remarkable isn't what it does, which remains classified, but what happened to the institutional knowledge of how to produce it. Fog bank is a classified material used in the W-76 nuclear warhead, which is the primary warhead of the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile, the backbone of the American nuclear deterrent. It is described in available public sources and declassified portions of nuclear weapons modernization reports as an interstage material, placing it in the mechanism by which a fission primary stage triggers the fusion secondary stage in a thermonuclear weapon. Its specific chemical composition and function remain classified. What became publicly documented through the W-76-1 Life Extension Program, the program to refurbish and extend the life of the W-76 warhead, is that the United States National Nuclear Security Administration discovered it had lost the ability to manufacture fog bank. The engineers and chemists who had made it originally were retired or deceased. The specific production process had not been documented in a way that surviving personnel could reconstruct. The classified records were insufficient to recreate it without essentially rediscovering the manufacturing process from scratch. The refurbishment program spent hundreds of millions of dollars and years of work recreating the manufacturing capability. This is publicly documented in NENSA budget documents and program reports submitted to Congress. It represents one of the clearest examples of institutional knowledge loss in the most sensitive possible domain. America briefly didn't fully know how to maintain its own nuclear deterrent. Story 18, Britain and China. Opium and Empire. The colonial drug war. Nobody romanticizes the story this entry is gesturing toward. Britain and China, trade and drugs, is one of the most documented, least disputed, and most morally clarifying episodes in colonial history, and it's worth telling straight, because the actual facts are sufficiently extraordinary that they don't require embellishment. Britain's trade with China in the 18th and early 19th centuries faced a structural problem. The British wanted enormous quantities of Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, but China had very limited interest in the manufactured goods Britain exported, demanding payment in silver instead. This created a significant balance of trade problem for Britain and the East India Company, which was responsible for managing the trade. The solution the East India Company arrived at was opium. The company grew opium in Bengal, smuggled it into China against explicit Chinese law and imperial prohibition, and used the proceeds to fund its purchases of Chinese goods. When the Chinese government attempted to enforce its own laws against the trade, seizing and destroying opium stocks, enforcing penalties against Chinese traders involved in the illegal traffic, Britain went to war. Twice, the First and Second Opium Wars of 1839-42 and 1856-60 resulted in China being forced, through military defeat, to legalize the opium trade, open additional ports, cede Hong Kong, and pay substantial indemnities. This is not contested history. The British government deliberately used military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept the importation of a drug its government had outlawed, having decided that the profits from the trade were worth defending with warships. The scale of opium addiction in China by the late 19th century, affecting perhaps 1 in 10 Chinese adults, was a direct consequence of this policy. Story 19: The Hound of Mons. The wolfhound legend of World War I, the Hound of Mons, is a piece of World War I folklore that sits alongside similar stories about the Angels of Mons and the Bowmen of Mons in the specific genre of supernatural legend that emerged from the unprecedented horror of the Western Front, a cultural response to industrialized slaughter that produced ghost stories with unusual vividness and staying power. The Hound of Mons describes a spectral or genuinely monstrous wolfhound-like creature reported by soldiers on the Western Front, particularly in the area around Mons in Belgium. Unlike the Angels of Mons story, which originated in a clearly fictional short story by Arthur Machen published in 1914 and was subsequently misremembered as factual reporting, the Hound of Mons legend has a slightly more complicated provenance, drawing on both general ghost story tradition and on specific claims made by individuals who said they had encountered the creature in the no man's land between trenches. The original Hound of Mons narrative, as it developed in various versions, connected the creature to a scientist who had allegedly trained an actual large dog using criminal corpses, resulting in either the death of the trainer by his creation or the subsequent haunting of the battlefield by the creature. This backstory has the structure of a campfire story constructed to explain a prior rumor rather than a primary account. No contemporary first-hand account with specific identifying details has been found that predates the retrospective narratives that claim to explain the creature's origin. What the Hound of Mons story genuinely reflects is the psychological reality of soldiers in a landscape of extraordinary violence and darkness, in positions where sounds and shapes in the no man's land were never fully explained, where survival required treating everything unfamiliar as a potential threat. The legends filled gaps that official reports couldn't. Story 20: If aliens are expansionist colonizers, physics is our best bet. A strategic assessment. This is a genuinely interesting strategic logic exercise dressed up in speculative framing. And it's worth taking seriously on its own terms, because the underlying argument that any sufficiently advanced alien civilization we're likely to encounter would be, by definition, expansionist, and that our defense posture should assume adversarial intent is one that some serious researchers in the field of existential risk and SETI take quite seriously. The argument for assuming adversarial expansion as the default goes roughly like this: civilizations that remain local to their home system are not detectable at interstellar distances and do not appear at Earth. Civilizations that expand across interstellar space necessarily possess propulsion technology that would make them orders of magnitude more powerful than Earth's current civilization. And the cultural or institutional frameworks of any civilization that has sustained multi-generational interstellar expansion projects are likely to have specific characteristics, including resource acquisition as a sustained institutional priority, that don't obviously favor benign contact with less advanced civilizations encountered along the way. The physics is physics point is actually the most interesting one. The laws governing what weapons can do are the same everywhere. A sufficiently energetic beam weapon, kinetic impactor, or explosive works on the same principles regardless of who built it. The gap between a civilization capable of interstellar travel and one that isn't would be enormous in propulsion and materials technology, but the fundamental physics of energy release and its effects on matter is universal. This doesn't mean our weapons would be effective against a substantially more advanced civilization. The delivery and targeting problem might be insurmountable, but the underlying physics of what physical processes can damage things is, as stated, universal. Story 21: Swissair Flight 111. The crash near Peggy's Cove that ended 229 people. Swissair Flight 111 departed New York's JFK Airport on September 2, 1998, bound for Geneva with 229 people aboard. At 10:31 p.m., the crew reported an unusual smell in the cockpit, and declared an emergency, diverting toward Halifax, Nova Scotia. Before they could reach the airport, a fire in the aircraft's insulation and electrical systems above the cockpit disabled increasing numbers of aircraft systems. The aircraft went down off Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia, at 10:31 p.m. local time. There were no survivors. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in aviation history, involving the recovery of approximately 98% of the aircraft from the ocean floor and exhaustive examination of every component and system. The official cause was identified as an arc fault in the in-flight entertainment system wiring, which ignited flammable insulation material and produced a fire that spread within the aircraft structure and eventually disabled the flight crew's ability to control the plane. The resulting changes to aviation safety standards were significant. The flammable insulation material used in the MD-11 and other aircraft was identified as a serious hazard and removed from the fleet. In-flight entertainment system wiring standards were revised, and the fire suppression and detection standards for areas of aircraft structure not directly accessible to the crew were substantially strengthened. This entry appears on a military conspiracy list and doesn't have a documented military dimension. It was a civilian aviation accident whose cause was thoroughly investigated and publicly documented. The mention of it here, contextually placed after a discussion of Antarctic super soldiers, may reflect a different story being confused with this one in the original source material, or simply a misplaced entry. What it is, unambiguously, is a genuine tragedy whose investigation genuinely improved aviation safety for the aircraft that followed. Story 22: Yamashita's Gold, the Philippines treasure legend that's driven decades of digging Yamashita's treasure, sometimes called Yamashita's Gold, is one of the most persistent treasure legends of the 20th century. And unlike most such legends, it has enough documented historical basis to have driven actual government-level interest, formal court proceedings, and sustained physical search operations across the Philippines for decades. The premise: during the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia from 1941 to 1945, enormous quantities of looted wealth, gold bullion, jewelry, artworks, and other valuables stolen from the Philippines, China, Southeast Asia, and other occupied territories were shipped to the Philippines. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, was allegedly in charge of concealing this accumulated loot in a series of underground tunnels, caves, and burial sites across the Philippine archipelago before the American reconquest. When Japan surrendered, the treasure remained hidden. The documented historical basis includes confirmed Japanese looting operations across occupied Asia, Operation Golden Lily, documented in various Japanese military records and post-war investigations, is the name given to the systematic collection and transport of looted wealth. The Philippines received significant quantities of this material. What's disputed is how much was buried versus transported back to Japan or destroyed, and whether the specific buried treasure caches described in various treasure maps and accounts of former Japanese soldiers are real. The legend has genuine legal consequences. A 1988 Philippine court case involving treasure hunter Rogelio Roxas and Ferdinand Marcos produced a decision awarding Roxas substantial damages for theft of treasure he claimed to have found. Actual legal proceedings treating the treasure as real and legally recoverable property. The story has moved in and out of credibility for 80 years and shows no sign of resolution. Story 23: Mountain Goddesses and Soldiers, when battlefield encounters meet spiritual tradition across many cultures with strong mountain traditions. There are documented accounts of encounters between soldiers and supernatural female figures associated with high peaks, protective presences that guided lost soldiers, warned of danger, or were credited by survivors with improbable rescues from impossible situations. These accounts come from multiple war contexts and multiple cultural traditions, which gives them an interesting cross-cultural consistency that's worth examining beyond any individual claim. Japanese military culture has accounts of Yama no Kami, mountain deities, encountered by soldiers in the mountainous terrain of various Pacific campaigns. Himalayan cultures have extensive traditions of mountain goddesses, and accounts from soldiers in the Tibet and Nepal regions across various conflicts include encounters attributed to these figures. In the Korean War, accounts from soldiers on both sides of the DMZ include encounters in the mountainous terrain of the peninsula with protective female figures fitting traditional Korean shamanic spiritual frameworks. The psychological dimension here is worth taking seriously, even if the supernatural dimension is bracketed. Soldiers in extreme survival situations, lost, wounded, separated from units, in brutal weather and terrain, are known to experience what survival psychologists call the third man factor, described extensively by John Geiger in his book of the same name. A presence, sometimes seen, sometimes felt, sometimes heard, that accompanies people in extremis and provides guidance or simply the presence of another being in a situation of extreme isolation. This phenomenon is documented across enough survival cases, including by mountaineers, polar explorers, and lone sailors, to be considered a genuine psychological phenomenon rather than fantasy. Whether that presence is a psychological product of extreme stress or something else is where the genuine uncertainty lives. Story 24, The Battle of Ramari Island. Did saltwater crocodiles end hundreds of Japanese soldiers? The Battle of Ramari Island in January-February 1945 was a real British military operation during the Burma campaign, in which British forces landed on and secured Ramari Island off the Burmese coast, driving Japanese defenders into the surrounding mangrove swamps rather than allowing them to break out and rejoin Japanese forces on the mainland. The island's mangrove swamps are indeed inhabited by saltwater crocodiles, one of the most dangerous crocodilian species, known to grow to 6 meters and considered genuinely dangerous to humans. The claim that is attached to this engagement, that somewhere between 400 and 1,000 Japanese soldiers who entered the swamps in retreat died over several nights to crocodile predation, with the screaming heard by British forces surrounding the swamps, appears in a book written by British naturalist Bruce Stanley Wright, who claimed to have been present, and was subsequently cited by the Guinness Book of Records as the worst recorded crocodile attack in history. The historical problems with this account are significant enough that serious military historians treat it with considerable skepticism. Japanese military records account for the soldiers perished or captured at Ramari in ways that don't align cleanly with the mass crocodile death scenario. The British official history of the Burma campaign doesn't mention the crocodile episode in a context where, if true, it would certainly have been noteworthy. Wright's account is the primary source, and primary sources from a single witness making a dramatic claim about a dramatic event are the kind that require corroboration to credit fully. What's certain? The battle happened. The swamps are full of crocodiles. Some Japanese soldiers died in those swamps, and the truth of what happened is significantly less documented than the legend that grew around it. Story 25, Stargate and Scanate. The CIA really did try to use psychics to spy on the Soviet Union Project Stargate is one of the genuinely confirmed, documented, extraordinary things the United States government has done. A program that sounds like fiction and is not. The CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency funded research into remote viewing, the claimed ability to perceive distant locations or events using only the mind, with no conventional sensory access, from 1972 through 1995, at a total cost of approximately $20 million over 2 decades. The program began under the name Scanate and evolved through various codenames: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. It was conducted primarily at Stanford Research Institute under physicists Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who developed experimental protocols designed to test and train remote viewing under controlled conditions. The research subjects included both trained intelligence personnel and civilian recruits selected for apparent psychic sensitivity. The operational products were used in actual intelligence work. Remote viewers were tasked against specific intelligence targets, including Soviet military installations, hostage locations, and nuclear facilities. Whether the results were operationally valuable is the genuinely contested question. Some specific reported successes are cited by program supporters, while the formal 1995 review by the American Institutes for Research, conducted at the CIA's request, found that while some statistical effect existed in controlled experiments, the program had not produced results with demonstrated operational intelligence value. The CIA terminated the program in 1995 and declassified its existence. The full operational records remain partially classified. The documented reality, a 2-decade, multi-million-dollar intelligence program explicitly attempting to weaponize psychic perception, is confirmed. Whether it worked is a question that honest researchers answer differently, depending on which evidence they weigh most heavily. Story 26, Captain William Schaffner, the RAF pilot who disappeared intercepting a UFO on September 8, 1970. American USAF Captain William Schaffner, on exchange duty with the RAF at Binbrook Station in Lincolnshire, was scrambled as part of an interception operation tracking an unidentified target over the North Sea. He took off in a Lightning fighter. He did not return. His aircraft was recovered from the seafloor weeks later. Schaffner was not in it and was never found. The official RAF inquiry attributed the accident to pilot error, specifically that Schaffner became spatially disoriented and flew into the sea while attempting the interception. The canopy was found open, the ejection seat was still in the aircraft, and Schaffner's body was never recovered, which the official account attributes to drowning after a water landing or ejection. What's generated the persistent alternative accounts around this case is a document described by its proponents as a genuine RAF transcript of Schaffner's radio communications during the final minutes of the flight that has circulated in UFO research communities since the 1990s. The document, if genuine, describes Schaffner reporting an extraordinary encounter. A bright conical object attempts to maneuver alongside it, a luminescent bubble forming around his aircraft, and then communication ending. The RAF has described this document as a fabrication. The factual basis is clear. Schaffner disappeared on an interception mission on this date. His aircraft was recovered empty, and his body was never found. The nature of the target he was intercepting, identified in official records as an Avro Shackleton aircraft, a British maritime patrol plane operating in the area, does not support the extraordinary encounter described in the disputed transcript. Whether the official explanation accounts for all the available evidence is what keeps the case discussed in UFO research circles decades later. Story 27, the Nephilim and military preparedness. The theological what-if with tactical implications. The Nephilim, described in Genesis 6 as the offspring of sons of God and human women, typically interpreted as giants of supernatural origin, appear in the Old Testament in a context that has generated extraordinary amounts of interpretive and conspiratorial elaboration, with a specific contemporary strand connecting these ancient texts to the Kandahar giant accounts and similar claims of anomalous large humanoid encounters in military contexts. The theological position being stated here is genuinely held within certain communities, that the Nephilim described in Scripture were real, physical beings, that some form of these beings either survived or has been recreated and exists today, and that governments are either aware of and concealing them, or are genuinely unprepared for the possibility of their existence. The Kandahar giant story sits in this framework for its believers as physical confirmation of what Scripture predicts. The military logic the entry is proposing is straightforward. Either we already have the weapons to deal with beings of the described scale and physical capability, or they are beyond our ability to neutralize with current technology. This is an interesting thought experiment regardless of its supernatural premises. A being of the size described in various giant accounts, 12 to 15 feet, proportionally scaled musculature, would have specific vulnerabilities and specific strengths relative to conventional small arms and military technology. The physics of scale are not in favor of the giant. Bone and tissue don't scale linearly with size, and very large organisms face structural and physiological limitations that would make them vulnerable to conventional weapons in ways that smaller, more agile opponents might not be. The genuinely interesting version of this thought experiment is the military planning one. What do you do when your threat matrix includes adversaries outside your normal threat model? Story 28, the Missing Scientist Network. When researchers in sensitive fields just vanish, the missing scientists phenomenon refers to a documented pattern, acknowledged by intelligence services and studied by investigative journalists, of scientists and engineers working in specific sensitive technical fields, dying under ambiguous circumstances or disappearing in clusters that are difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The most extensively documented example involves British defense contractors in the 1980s, a series of scientists and engineers working on SDI-related classified defense electronics programs, who died within a several-year window under circumstances ranging from suicide to accident to apparent natural causes. The cluster of deaths attracted enough attention at the time that there were parliamentary questions, journalistic investigations, and official inquiries. Some deaths were concluded to be genuine suicides or accidents. Others remained ambiguous, and the question of whether the cluster represented coincidence or something deliberate was never definitively answered. Similar patterns have been noted across other contexts. Soviet-era scientists working on sensitive programs who defected to the West and subsequently faced violence. Researchers involved in biological weapons programs dying under circumstances that generated intelligence interest, and nuclear scientists in specific countries facing apparently targeted violence. The documented reality is that states do target scientists working on adversarial weapons programs. Israel's documented operations against Iranian nuclear scientists are the most clearly confirmed modern example, and the covert operations of intelligence services can produce outcomes that look, from outside, like coincidental deaths. The Missing Scientist Network as a coordinated, ongoing entity suppressing technological development is a more organized claim than the evidence specifically supports. The individual cases of scientists in sensitive fields dying in clusters are real, and some are confirmed to have involved state action. Story 29, the Pentagon-planted UFO mythos. What if the disclosure movement is the PSYOP? This is a theory about the UFO/UAP disclosure movement that comes from within the intelligence and national security research community rather than from UFO believers, and it deserves serious engagement because it's coherent and supported by at least some documented evidence about how military disinformation operations have historically functioned. The argument runs as follows. The persistent public belief that the government is hiding alien technology at places like Area 51 is not merely a nuisance to be managed. It is actively useful to military and intelligence agencies. A population that believes UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft is a population that does not ask the correct questions about what it's actually seeing, which is classified human-made technology. The UFO mythos functions as the perfect cover story. It's embarrassing enough that people who report seeing something are easily dismissed. It redirects public curiosity away from the actual classified programs, and it adds an extra layer of protection to genuine black projects by surrounding them with implausible supernatural interpretations. There is a documented historical basis for this. The CIA's own history of the U-2 program explicitly acknowledges that civilian UFO sightings of the U-2, which was flying at altitudes far beyond any publicly acknowledged aircraft at the time, were allowed to stand uncorrected, because correcting them would have required acknowledging the classified aircraft. The extraterrestrial interpretation was more useful than the truth. The more provocative version of this argument, that the current UAP disclosure movement, including congressional testimony and official acknowledgement of unexplained phenomena, is itself a managed information operation designed to serve other strategic purposes, is where the evidence thins considerably. But the structural logic is not obviously wrong. Story 30, Project Rainbow and the Chronosphere. where Philadelphia Experiment meets Science Fiction Project Rainbow, is one of the names attached to the extended mythology surrounding the Philadelphia Experiment, the alleged teleportation of the Us Eldridge, and the chronosphere is a concept that emerges from the more elaborate versions of this mythology, describing a device capable of manipulating temporal or spatial reality using powerful electromagnetic fields. The chronosphere as a specific concept has roots primarily in fictional rather than historical ground. It appears prominently in the Command and Conquer, Red Alert video game series, where it functions as a superweapon capable of teleporting units across the battlefield. Whether the game's designers were drawing on genuine conspiracy mythology or simply invented the term is a question about creative direction rather than military history. The underlying mythology these concepts draw on is the Philadelphia Experiment legend, covered elsewhere on this list, which is itself built on a foundation of documented Navy degaussing research inflated into something much more extraordinary by a single, unverifiable source. The extension of this into time travel and chronosphere technology is a further elaboration with no documentary basis whatsoever in any declassified or leaked military record. What this category of story represents is interesting for a different reason. It traces the specific path by which a military technology myth can migrate from an initial pseudo-historical claim through elaboration in conspiracy literature into mainstream popular fiction and back into conspiracy discourse, where fictional elements are sometimes misremembered as historical claims. The circularity of this process, fiction absorbing myth absorbing fiction, is one of the distinctive features of how military conspiracy mythology develops and self-sustains. Story 31: Mount Weather, the real continuity of government facility that Congress barely knew about. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center is real. Its existence has been confirmed, and the gap between what the American public and most of Congress knew about it for decades and what it actually was and did is genuinely remarkable for a democratic country that supposedly maintains civilian oversight of its government. Mount Weather is a facility located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, built in the 1950s as a continuity of government bunker, a hardened facility designed to allow the executive branch and essential government functions to survive a nuclear attack on Washington, D.C. It is operated by FEMA, is staffed year-round, and has a substantial underground complex capable of housing hundreds of government officials and essential personnel. The remarkable thing is how long the full scope of the facility was kept from most of Congress. A 1975 Senate subcommittee investigating emergency preparedness found that they could not get satisfactory answers about what authorities the facility's governing plans gave the executive in an emergency, what laws were suspended in a declared national emergency, or who the essential personnel designated for the facility actually were. The facility operated under legal frameworks and executive orders that designated a shadow government apparatus whose existence and powers were unknown to most elected officials. The Greenbrier Bunker, a separate facility under the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, designed to house Congress in a nuclear emergency, was kept secret from the public for 32 years until a 1992 Washington Post investigation. A facility literally built to preserve the United States Congress was kept secret from most members of Congress for 3 decades. Both facilities exist. Both were built in secret. Both operated under legal frameworks that most elected officials weren't briefed on. That's the confirmed reality underlying the secret government bunker category of conspiracy theory. Story 32: Project Grill Flame. The early Stargate program, before they called it Stargate Project Grill Flame, was an early codename for what eventually became the full Stargate remote viewing program, covering the initial phase of the CIA and DIA's investment in paranormal intelligence collection from roughly 1978 through the early 1980s, before the program was restructured and renamed multiple times. Grill Flame is where the operational remote viewing effort moved from pure research into attempted intelligence application, where viewers were tasked against specific targets and their reported perceptions evaluated against available intelligence to assess accuracy. The targets included Soviet military facilities, attempts to locate American hostages being held in Iran during the hostage crisis, and various intelligence targets of opportunity that were difficult to access through conventional means. The specific operational case that generated the most discussion within the program involved a series of sessions targeting the Soviet Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in Kazakhstan. Remote viewers provided descriptions of the facility that, when compared with later satellite imagery and human intelligence, were judged by program managers to contain accurate details not available from other sources at the time the sessions occurred. This case is cited by program supporters as evidence of genuine operational utility. Skeptics note that the comparison was done post hoc, that memory and interpretation effects could explain the apparent matches, and that controlled experiment results were the appropriate basis for evaluating the program, not self-selected successful cases. The broader Stargate story is covered elsewhere in this collection. Grill Flame specifically is worth knowing as a separate name, because it represents the period when the program moved from "can this work in controlled conditions" to "let's try it operationally," a significant institutional commitment that preceded the full two-decade investment. Story 33, The Douse Hum. The low-frequency sound that only some people hear and nobody has fully explained the Douse Hum is one of the more genuinely investigated and genuinely unresolved acoustic mysteries documented in the United States. Beginning in the early 1990s, residents of the Taos, New Mexico area began reporting a persistent low-frequency hum, described as similar to a diesel engine idling, that was audible to some people, but completely inaudible to others, and completely undetectable by standard acoustic monitoring equipment deployed in the investigation. The investigation was serious. A team from multiple American universities and research institutions, commissioned by Congress after persistent constituent reports, spent time in the Taos area attempting to identify the source and characterize the phenomenon. Their report, published in 1997, concluded that the hum was real in the sense that a meaningful percentage of residents genuinely perceived it and reported consistent characteristics, but that they were unable to identify its source or detect it instrumentally in a way that would allow physical analysis. The theories that have been proposed range from the mundane to the exotic. Industrial sources, pipeline pressure, underground natural gas transmission, DUMA, have been investigated without confirmed linkage. The military connection is the most persistently argued. The Taos area has proximity to various military and government installations in New Mexico, and low-frequency acoustic signals have genuine military applications in communications and as potential non-lethal weapons research. Very low-frequency communications used for submarine communication operate in frequency ranges that could theoretically produce the described phenomenon under specific propagation conditions. No definitive source has been confirmed. The hum continues to be reported. The investigation found something real that it couldn't explain. Story 34, The Greenbrier Bunker. Congress's nuclear shelter stayed secret for 32 years. The Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, is one of America's most storied luxury hotels, hosting presidents and foreign dignitaries since the 18th century. From 1958 to 1992, it also contained a fully functional classified government facility built specifically to house all 535 members of Congress and their essential staff in the event of a nuclear attack, a bunker large enough for the entire legislative branch, concealed in a new wing added to the resort in 1958. The facility, codenamed Project Greek Island, contained individual dormitory rooms, a cafeteria, a medical clinic, a communication center, and a large meeting space designed to accommodate both the Senate and the House of Representatives simultaneously. It was maintained in a state of constant readiness by a cover team that operated as a television equipment company providing services to the resort. Supplies were regularly rotated and updated. The staff knew what they were maintaining, but maintained the fiction for 3 decades. The secret was held from 1958 until 1992, when Ted Gupp of the Washington Post published an article revealing the facility's existence and purpose in detail. The revelation that such a facility existed, a full congressional shelter hidden inside a luxury resort, maintaining the fiction for 32 years, was itself a story. But the more significant revelation was what it implied about the broader continuity of government planning that members of Congress were largely not briefed on. The legislative branch had been allocated a nuclear shelter that was effectively secret from most of the people who would theoretically occupy it. Once the story was published, the facility was decommissioned. Its secrecy was its operational viability. It's now a museum tour. Story 35, The Stab in the Back. The military myth that destroyed a republic and built a dictatorship, the Dolchstoß Legende, literally the stab in the back legend, is one of the most consequential and best documented examples of a military conspiracy theory becoming the foundation of a political movement that fundamentally altered the course of history. And it's worth understanding precisely because it illustrates how a demonstrably false narrative about military betrayal can become politically more powerful than the documented truth. The claim originated from senior German military commanders in the aftermath of World War I, specifically Generals Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg. The actual military situation in November 1918 was that the German army was exhausted, unable to continue offensive operations, facing collapse in multiple sectors, and that Ludendorff himself had requested armistice negotiations. The war ended because Germany was losing it militarily. The stab in the back narrative inverted this. It claimed that the German army had been undefeated in the field, and that the armistice had been forced on a still fighting military by betrayal from within, socialists, Jews, and civilian leadership, who had undermined the war effort and stabbed a victorious army in the back, rather than allowed it to fight to final victory. This narrative was demonstrably false, as documented military records established clearly. Ludendorff, who had personally requested the armistice, subsequently promoted the myth that the armistice had been forced on a winning army by traitors. The political consequences of this false narrative are among the most catastrophic in modern history. It provided Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist movement with a grievance framework, a set of domestic enemies to blame, and a path to power built on the promise of avenging a betrayal that had never occurred. Military myths with political utility can outperform historical truth for generations, and the consequences of that outperformance can be measured in millions of deaths.